live. Welcome back for those who've been missing this for the last couple of weeks. This is a chat that I've been looking forward to for quite a while. My guest is one of the most respected people within the Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones community, and someone who I know reads the books on a regular basis. And we were chatting when we were over in Nashville for Con of Thrones about this very subject, and we were talking about the idea of whether Bran will be king in the books as well as on the show. So I'll start by letting my guest introduce himself. I'm sure you know him already, but Aziz, do you want to say hi?
I do. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm back at home after traipsing around several conventions in Ireland, and it was really wonderful to see filming locations and to think about things that inspired the series. Is like a different approach to some of the material. And now it's back to talking about the books, and that's where I feel very comfortable. So I'm very happy to be here. This is going to be fun.
Excellent. Well, why don't we start with just a sort of the high level question. So as I said, this live stream idea came from a chat that we had when we were over in Nashville, and we were talking about this idea of Bran being the king, which for a lot of people seemed quite left field. But you said you'd already started doing a reread of the books, and I know you read the books through quite a lot. You'd already started a reread, and there was quite a lot of symbolism that we'd missed as a community. So let's start with the top level question. Do you think in the books Bran will become king of the 7 or 6 kingdoms?
Yes. And additionally, I believe that he will leap out of the book and become king of Earth as well.
Okay, you have to unpack that for me, Aziz.
Well, we'll leave off that second part. I'm working on that theory still. But yeah, no, I do think he'll be king at the end of the books. I think that now that we know to look for it, and that we're finding it, and sometimes you see what you want to see. That's kind of that's a trick or a trap that anyone can fall into, seeing what you want to see. But there's at a certain point when there's just so much evidence, you can kind of feel comfortable that you're not just seeing what you want to see, and that it's real and the evidence is very strong. So yeah, I do feel pretty strongly about it now. I haven't gone all the way through the books. We're doing it, at a nice pace on over on History of Westeros, and by the time we get to the end, I'm sure we'll have found more clues. But just with book 1, there's quite a lot, in particular because George packed more foreshadowing into the first book than the others, because he originally intended it to be a trilogy. So he kind of had to put more in there. Once he realized it was going to be a longer series, he was able to space it out a bit more. But also, the beginning of character arcs is a lot of times where the clues for the end of those arcs are, maybe even more so than in the middle. But that's not a universal truth. But it is common enough from what we've seen in Game of Thrones. So, yeah, good stuff.
So do you think it's important that not only the first proper chapter of Game of Thrones is Bran, but also when George R.R. Martin talks about where he got the idea for the story, the genesis of the story, it's with that scene that we saw on the show. It's in the books as well, where we get the wolf or the direwolf cubs, and it's from the perspective of Bran, and he's very clear that he starts with Bran and then he moves out from that. Do you think that it's important that it starts with Bran?
Kind of, yeah. I think that, part of that is just the way is George rolling with his idea. Like you said, he envisioned, that's the first scene he basically imagined. It was the first thing that he wrote in the story. He went and added the prologue and these other things later. And it's certainly a bit of a trope that a boy or a young character, it could be a girl, by the end becomes the ruler, the queen, the hero, or what have you. And I think George has obscured that in a number of ways. One of them, well, we'll get into some of the more detailed details as we go through. But from a high level view, because he breaks so many other tropes, I think that threw people off. And because his arc is just he went north, and the way things are right now in the books, it does seem far-fetched. But that, far-fetched or not, the foreshadowing is very strong, and there's a lot to look at that points in that direction, even taking out the show. But the show obviously added things as well. So yeah, the fact that he's the first character, I don't know if it's important. I guess it is in a way, but I guess it depends on what you mean by important. It's certainly relevant, and it's certainly, for people who doubt the truth of it, I think it's or doubt whether it's going to happen in the books or not. I think this is evidence that it will. A small piece of evidence, because the hero's journey, in a sense, it's not, well, it's a change to the hero's journey in some ways, but in other ways it's familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was saying it's important, what I was trying to say was, when George R. R. Martin first conceptualized this story, it was a story about Bran. And then he built out from that. And I mean, I don't have the quote to hand, but when he talks about it, he talks about this child who has this experience, and then you have to think, well, this child has got a family, and then those people have got friends, and they've got enemies, and all the rest of it. So he first started thinking about this as about Bran's journey and story. So that's, I mean, as I say, important might be the wrong word, but I think it's quite indicative of where George R. R. Martin's mind was at the very start of him drafting up this story. Stephen Stark, by the way, hi, great to see you, Stephen. Thank you very much for the super chat, saying legend on the left, legend on the right. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Thanks, Stephen.
So let's, I know you've been doing your reread, and you're focusing first on book 1, A Game of Thrones. Are there any kind of like overarching quotes or thoughts, and is there anything that leaps out from that makes you think that Bran will be king?
Well, there's a few. One that I just stumbled on last night that's kind of a funny one, actually. Let me grab that for you. We actually posted this one on Twitter. It's the freshest one. I've got more, but this is one of the newest ones we have. Where did it go? I need a second to find it. There are so many good ones early on. There's like, but one thing that George does really well is that we all know that there's foreshadowing for him to be a green seer, and then we actually see that happen. The thing is that the foreshadowing for being a green seer and the foreshadowing for being a king have a lot in common, because there's a lot of symbolism that works for both, as in you're kind of above everybody. And you can see, as in terms of like a hierarchy, as a king, you're above everybody. But when Bran is, say, in his second chapter, he's looking down at all, he's climbing the tower, and he's looking down at all these different groups of people doing work. He's looking at one group of people hanging out by the well. He's looking at some other people hammering on, forges, making armor, what have you, and other people carrying baskets around. It looks like a bird's eye view, which makes, originally, if you're thinking green seer, then that really fits, because he can be in a bird and be looking down on everybody. But that metaphor fits for the kingship as well, especially the Iron Throne, which is, even if Bran doesn't sit the actual Iron Throne, the Iron Throne of the books is really tall, and you look down on people. So metaphorically, literally, it works in a lot of ways. But here's this first quote. I like this one a lot. Most people, I think, are at least open to, if not accepting of, the idea that Mormont's Raven is a mouthpiece for Bloodraven sometimes, if not often.
That's canon.
Yeah, that's yeah, right.
It's true.
So here's a great one from near the end of Game One. This is from a Jon chapter. I believe it's Jon's. I think it's his second to last chapter in the books. It's the same chapter where he finds out, where Aemon talks to him about who he is, and it's right after Jon has been awarded Longclaw, and he's having dreams of his father's face in place of the white that he just fought. So there's a lot of Crypts of Winterfell stuff going on as well. Anyway, the quote is, "We have white shadows in the woods, and unquiet dead stalking our halls, and a boy sits the Iron Throne," he said in disgust. This is Jeor Mormont. And then the Raven comes in with the raven laughed shrilly, boy, 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 boy. And so I just looked at that yesterday and was like, he's laughing at us. Bloodraven is laughing at us. He's like, boy king. Yeah, you haven't seen a boy king yet. Joffrey's quite a bit older than Bran will be. So I don't know. That one might not even be a reference to King Bran, but you could look at it and see that. It works.
Anyone who watches this channel knows that my byword is, if in doubt, blame Bloodraven. So I'm very, very happy to accept that as a little bit of foreshadowing. I think before we get into it, I've got a few extra ones because I put a tweet out and a few people came in with a few things that might be foreshadowing of Bran being king that I just want to read out. But I just want to, and I'd love your thoughts on this as well as these. I just want to just put a little bit of a caveat in here, is that It's very easy to read into these kind of things and look back and cherry pick things that kind of prove your own point.
Yeah.
And how do you think this might be different from us just like cherry picking our own ideas about what? Oh yeah, obviously this now means that Bran is king because there was a sentence that included the words Bran and king in it, therefore he must be king. How do we guard against that in terms of this kind of like sort of literary interpretation?
I think mostly we get there by backing it up from lots of places. If all we have is a couple of quotes that vaguely sound sort of king-like, then yeah, that's just not enough. But if we have lots of them and we have it from multiple sources and we have different types of references, kind of like R plus L equals J. I mean, that's widely accepted. There's definitely some people that still think it'll be different in the books. And without getting into that, well, R plus L equals J has a lot of evidence for it, even if you take out the fact that it was revealed in the show. Let's ignore the show because we're trying to do that here. With your question kind of is asking the same thing here, to ignore what we saw in the show. Because if we go by the show, then yeah, it's going to happen. But we can't be 100% sure of that. And some people would say the same thing is true about R plus equals J. Until we see it for sure, we don't know. So, but we have to admit that there is a lot of evidence for R plus L equals J. You can't just look at that and say, oh, you're just seeing what you want to see. No, there's a lot of evidence for it. Even though it's not necessarily conclusive, I would say it's overwhelming. And there's a difference between conclusive and overwhelming. Conclusive means there's no doubt. Overwhelming means there's a lot of evidence, but it isn't. None of that evidence is 100% solid. So it's maybe in that regard, it's not as solid as R plus L equals J, King Bran, but it's very solid. And I think the farther we go through the books with this in mind, the more solid it'll get. But I think that's the thing. You just have to have repetition of the ideas. You can't just be looking at a couple of quotes, and you can't just be, can't reach. But I think it's supported.
And I think you're right. And I think the reason why we're discussing this so much is because the show is based on conversations with George R. R. Martin about what the ending of the books is. And most of what happened, give or take, fits into one of two camps. Either stuff that we've kind of figured out, R plus L equals J is the main example. So Dany gives into her Targaryen side, Fire and Blood. I did a couple of videos on this. I know a few other people did, but again, so there's a lot of things there that kind of fit into this camp of stuff we'd sort of figured out. There was some stuff that was clearly very just show, like the Night King and Arya. The showrunners said they created the character of the Night King. They created the fact that, or they decided Arya was going to be the one. That was their decision. This, I think, is the biggest thing that falls into like the third camp of stuff that most of us didn't see coming. And I'll be honest about that. There was a lot of stuff I was quite proud about with my predictions in season 8. There were one or two things I got quite wrong. Bran, I saw some of the foreshadowing for it, but I didn't pick it. And I think that I wasn't alone in that. The community as a whole was not expecting Bran to be king. I was just thinking it was going to be no one who was going to be king. So that, I think, is why we're in this position of talking about it a huge amount. So with that as the kind of like the preamble, I've got a couple. I'd love to hear any others you've got. I'm just going to read out a couple of the responses I got on Twitter.
Okay.
So Ravenous Reader says, and this was from A Dance with Dragons, a quote saying, and this is, I think, a Bran POV, where so this is Bran's thoughts. What was he now? Only Bran the broken boy, Brandon of House Stark, prince of a lost kingdom, lord of a burned castle, heir to ruins. Now, he was thinking about that in context of Winterfell, but if you think about that in terms of the show and King's Landing, actually Bran was indeed heir to a burned castle and to ruins. That was what
that's true.
He took over.
Good catch.
There's also a quote from George R. R. Martin, not in the books, but a general quote when he says, if a 12-year-old has to conquer the world, then so be it, which is an interesting quote. And then Pablo, this is a quote from A Clash of Kings. Maester Lewin brought you your food. He served you the king's cut off the roast. So I think what we're starting to pick up here is a number of different hints about Bran and king and inheritance. Is there anything that any other kind of quotes that you kind of draw on for that?
Well, yeah, there's a few. It's one I've been scrolling through my notes here while you've been reading those. Those are really good examples. One I like that's some of these are a little. Some people probably disagree that these are strong evidence. I don't think they're strong evidence. Like we said, none of these singularly are overwhelming. If they had been, then they probably would have been noticed already. I think it's part of, we have to keep in mind the author's intent here. And he clearly, if it's true in the books, he was clearly keeping it on the down low because, as you said, we did not see it coming, which for some people is evidence that it's not going to be the case. But it also could just be that he hit it really well. So I obviously lean towards the latter. Here's one. Sometimes Nan would talk to him as if he were her Brandon, the baby she had nursed all those years ago. And sometimes she confused him with his uncle Brandon, who was killed by the Mad King before Bran was even born. She had lived so long, Mother had told him once that all the Brandon Starks had become one person in her head. So I like that. Yeah, I like that one a lot because it's the continuum of Bran. There's so many King Brans. Brandon the Builder was the first kind of king that we know of, Stark king that we know of. And the idea that he's part of the weirwood network and part of this diaspora of historical Starks and all his journeys into the crypts to naming off all these kings that he knows so much about. I think that's a pretty good clue. And I really like the early stuff where it's not that the quotes indicate he's going to be king. It's that he's being put in situations that a king would be put in. He's facing the kind of decisions that a king will be put in. He's thinking the kind of thoughts that you would hope a king would have because he's showing empathy and mercy. And for that, we go to this very first chapter that you brought up already. And it's a wonderful place to start. If you think about what's happening in this first chapter, the execution of Garrett. So it's always important to remind us that it's Garrett, not Will. The show swapped them out. And it's a lesson in what we see at the end of Game of Thrones. The show is that this is fear versus love dichotomy that Dany is very interested in. She wants to be loved, but if it's got to be fear, it's got to be fear. And we see that right here in this opening scene. The Night's Watchman, Garrett, is dead from fear, according to Jon. You can see it in his eyes. And Robb thinks he died well. And they argue about it. And I love how this plays out. Bran is thinking about it. He's thoughtful. He doesn't just decide, which is, I think, kind of kingly in a way. He's takes it and he thinks about it and considers it. And his father notices him thinking and comes over. Ned says, "What did you think? Are you doing all right?" And Bran points out that Jon and Robb are arguing over whether he was afraid or not. And Ned says, what do you think? And I love that Bran still doesn't answer. he asks another question. He says, well, can a man be brave when he's afraid? Which, of course, the distraction there is that line is so brilliant that it kind of maybe hides some of the subtext. And Ned answers, and then Bran still doesn't necessarily weigh in with his take. He just still considers it. And then immediately afterwards, sorry, not yet. Actually, Ned explains to him why they had to execute him, and why he had to do it, because it's his duty. It might have been a mercy to let this man live, but he was a danger to others. So it was his duty trumps these other considerations. Duty trumps mercy here. But then immediately they go find the direwolves, and it's almost the exact same scenario. The direwolves are too dangerous to let live, just like the Night's Watch deserter. And Ned says they have to die. But Bran wants, and this is a real test, is there going to be a real test near the end of the series when you have foreigners in Westeros, foreigners who are not treated well. And, a lot of us try to value how a society treats its most vulnerable. And you're going to have, and so direwolf pups, well, that's a really tough decision. They're pups, so they're innocent. They haven't hurt anyone. But if they turn into, killer direwolves, well, that's a problem. That's a problem for a ruler. So Bran is faced with this same decision tree, but he has a support system to help him with it. He has his brothers, he has his father. Contrast to Daenerys, which, that's a whole nother story, but Daenerys doesn't have that. Daenerys had Viserys and Illyrio, and she's immediately being sold to Drogo from like the get-go. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but the point is that it's all an education for a king. He's being taught how to make these decisions, how to judge fear versus mercy, love versus duty. And, well, you love how he comes out here. He wants the wolves saved. And Jon, just to throw this out there, Jon is very clever. Ned's primary instinct is to be dutiful. He's like, well, these wolves have to die. It's my duty to protect the realm. Ned appeals to the only higher authority that there is. Jon appeals to the only higher authority there is, which is the gods. He says, look at these wolves. There's 5 of them. And there's 5 Stark kids. How about that? That's the gods did that. And Ned's like, oh. And that's, appeal to a higher authority, which, like I said, that is the only higher authority there is, the gods. And so, yeah. And so, also, Bran thinks how Jon removes himself from the count to make that work, which I think is maybe foreshadowing for Jon removing himself from the line of succession later. But anyway, that's probably getting too far afield. The point is that that opening scene is packed full of, the kingly the types of decisions that a king will have to struggle with, difficult types of things. And like you said, it's that first chapter. So I think you could see that intent right away. He's giving Bran these lessons from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. So Bran is learning leadership. So the first chapter is about Bran learning what it is to be in charge. And Ned is telling him, Jon is giving him hints and all the rest of it. We had a couple of super chats. Just want to say thank you to that. So Cat Girl of the North saying, just dropping a note of appreciation, carry on. Thank you so much. And Fräulein Meets saying, hey guys, thank you for keeping up the great work. Very much appreciated that. And before we went online, or before we went live, Maura Lee, thank you, Maura. You know how much I appreciate your generosity and support for the channel. Said, for Aziz and Ashaya, A History of Westeros, in honor of all the great content you both provide on your channel, and for the kitties. I don't know if you've seen any of the cats yet, but maybe they'll make an appearance later. Also, for Robert and all the fabulous guests and content that you provide for all of us to enjoy each Thursday, and for the fabulous second channel, The Well Told Tale. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And for Chrissy and all the fabulous mods. Yes, so thank you, moderators. I really appreciate what you do. Chrissy of Old Stones is definitely out there. I think we've got a few other moderators going on as well. Thank you. I really do appreciate what you do. Let's as in a moment, I want to get on to the questions I've got from my patrons, also any questions in the chat. But I want to talk, and I'd love your thoughts on this, about this idea of the weirwood throne. Now, I did a very quick search just through A Song of Ice and Fire for where the phrase weirwood throne appears. Now, it actually only appears 5 times. So I'm going to very quickly go through these because I think it's quite interesting and I think it's quite foreshadowy. So the first time is it's in the Eyrie. For those who don't know, the throne of the Arryns is a weirwood chair. It's a weirwood throne. I think it's a little bit of a sort of a distraction or digression as to why that might be the case. But the fact is that it's a weirwood throne. And so the first instance is Lysa Arryn rose from her weirwood throne. And that's establishing the case of what it is. Then we get the quote saying that she got Robert Arryn, Sweet Robin, seated on the weirwood throne with a stack of pillows underneath him, and sent word that his lordship would receive his guests. The boy greeted Lord Nestor. This is straight away, the weirwood throne is for a child. It's for Robert Arryn. That's the, even nice. When earlier on this was Lysa Arryn was there, it actually wasn't her throne, it was Robert Arryn's throne. It was a child's throne. So the weirwood throne is there for a child, is the kind of imagery we've been given. The next time this comes up, there's there's also, they don't actually use the words weirwood throne, but there's Beric Dondarrion appears seated in a sort of what is a weirwood root throne, as it were. But the next time that the phrase weirwood throne comes up is when Bran goes to Bloodraven's cave, and the first time he sees Bloodraven. And this is what it says. Before them, a pale lord in ebon finery sat dreaming in a tangled nest of roots, a woven weirwood throne that embraced his withered limbs as a mother does a child. So again, we're getting this imagery that a weirwood throne is for a child. The mother is the throne and the child here is Bloodraven. That's the image we're given in that very sentence. Then we get Bran. And we get the quote that under the hill, the broken boy sat upon the weirwood throne, listening to whispers in the dark as ravens walked up and down his arms. So again, we're getting a boy sitting in the weirwood throne. And then finally, we have this scene when Bran is starting to properly use his kind of like tree wizard powers, and he goes and he talks to his father. He just says a word, and Ned is there. Winterfell, Bran whispered. His father looked up. "Who's there?" he asked, turning. And Bran, frightened, pulled away. His father and the black pool and the godswood faded and were gone, and he was back in the cavern. The pale, thick roots of his weirwood throne cradling his limbs as a mother does a child. So again, we're getting this imagery of a mother and a child. Now, how important do you think this kind of imagery of the weirwood throne being there for a child might be?
I think it's pretty important. Yeah, like it's yet another thing. We're trying to, like we said at the beginning, there isn't just one thing. So we're adding to the list of items that seem to foreshadow this. And this is a very good, important part of that. You have, like you said, the weirwood throne seems like it's green shear foreshadowing. It's like what I was saying before, like George is masking this by having the green shear foreshadowing kind of on top of the King Bran foreshadowing. And the idea that if there's, a lot of us, maybe like you said, some of us thought the Iron Throne wouldn't be a thing at the end, and that was kind of true, but not really. I mean, the Iron Throne itself is gone, but the institution is basically the same, minus the North separated from it. So that wasn't a huge change. But I think that was part of what obscured it. If people are envisioning Bran sitting in the Iron Throne, well, that doesn't seem to have imagery directly. It has him in thrones, but not the Iron Throne. And that probably is part of the how George has hidden it. Because he's already in his weirwood seat, as we know. But back before the TV show, there was a lot of doubt as to whether Bran would ever leave the cave. That was a theory that a lot of us entertained, if not believed outright, that Bran was going to stay there, that he was going to become part of the tree, and that would be it. He's you know, a character that exists from afar and that manipulates events with his magic and can reveal things to us through his thoughts, but isn't necessarily going to leave. But clearly, almost certainly, that's not the case. I think the show is accurate that he's going to leave the cave. There's a lot of foreshadowing for that. Hold the door has to happen, in some form or fashion. So I think it's pretty important. Also think it's important to point out just a small thing here, that Bran in the books looks different than Bran in the show. A lot of the TV show characters look a lot like their book version, but a lot of them don't. And Bran's a good example of someone who doesn't. He kind of has the TV show version of the Stark look, where really in the books he looks like a Tully. And to me, that's a little interesting that he's a Green Seer king, if you want to call him that, or will be, and has blue eyes and red hair, and hey, green, red, and blue, those are the colors of the trident. I don't think that really necessarily matters, but it's kind of cool that it lines up like that. But it does matter. I think that Bran looks like a Southerner. I think that would make him a little bit more accepted in the South, that he looks like one of them rather than a Northerner, because the Starks have a very distinct look, as we know. Like even wildlings are like, hey, that Jon Snow, he looks like a Stark. They have a look, but Bran looks like a Tully. And that might actually matter a little bit in terms of if he's elected through the Great Council. I think that could help.
Yeah, and just to very briefly pick up on that green, red, and blue reference. So for those who don't know, the Trident River, the river that we get the climactic battle with Rhaegar and Robert Baratheon, that moves on past very close to the Isle of the Gods and the God's Eye Lake, then the Isle of Faces, and the God's Eye Lake. That has three tributaries: the red, the blue, and the green, and that is sort of important, because those are what feed into this clear area that is going to be important in the books. The God's Eye Lake, the Isle of Faces, Harrenhal, the Ruby Ford was clearly important. That is clearly the central place in the books in a way that it wasn't on the show. Now, I did see, I think it might have been on Facebook, somebody referenced Arya. This is in perhaps a bit of a tangent, but Arya, when she's starting to do her prayer, her list of people to kill, she just offhand says, "Oh, no gods are coming to Harrenhal." And it's like, that seems like a little kind of like meaningful, because my best guess, and this is for a subject for a completely different live stream, but my best guess is that Bran will be coming. And I think that he is going to be taking up this position, not just as king, but almost this kind of god king, so sort of the representatives of the old gods, and perhaps even ruling from the Isle of Faces. But we'll get onto that in just one moment.
Because, I like that idea too.
Yeah, we've got some questions about that. Before we move on to the questions, as I say, I've been kind of trailing this for a while. We had some fantastic questions from my patrons. Stephen Stark, thank you so much for the super chat, saying, "In solidarity with Robert's beard, looking good, sir." Well, thank you very much. I think Aziz's beard is equally fine, if not finer. So, but that's very kind of you to say so. Let's move on to a couple of questions. So we had, as a starter, we've got Casey Corbridge, talking about the regions of Westeros, saying, what are the chances that the regions of Westeros, the North, Westlands, the Reach, and so on, will remain united under King Bran? What would be able to keep them together and not seek out their independence? So I think this is a kind of a question. If we've got King Bran, that I think we're kind of moving towards the idea that this is likely. Is he going to be King Bran of the Seven Kingdoms, or just of the Six Kingdoms as he was on the show, or something different?
That's tricky. I feel like Sansa's right on the cusp. I lean towards her show ending being accurate, but I'm less sold on it than a few of the others. I think it's pretty likely. But and I do think and during our reread, I do see a lot of Sansa Queen foreshadowing. So I think it's pretty solid. But on the other hand, it does seem a little strange for Bran to be king of all the kingdoms except the one he's from. But it is what it is. I think the foreshadowing is there. It doesn't mean it's an automatic thing. It's not necessarily a slam dunk, but it is where the evidence seems to be pointing, in my opinion. And you could see how Sansa and Bran could make such an arrangement because they're brother and sister. It's a little less feasible if it's just two other factions having to agree on something like that. The fact that their family might make it easier, but there's definitely, if we're entertaining the idea that it's not true, which we should, if we're trying to be thorough, then you have to look at it differently. You have to think, well, Sansa might be queen for a while, but won't finish as queen. Maybe she marries Fagon or something like that. That's a little, I don't see how that would happen, but I'm just throwing an idea out there, marrying someone else that is king for a little while. And that's how we satisfy the queen foreshadowing without her being queen at the end. So you can see why I lean the other way, because this is a little wonky to imagine her marrying Fagon. I just don't see that happening. But I'm like, if I'm trying to make it connect the dots in my head, that's kind of one place where I go. It just doesn't seem to work.
What is so Pegleg Pete over on Patreon was saying that we know that you reread the books looking for signs of Bran becoming king. Did you get any Sansa or Arya new revelations in terms of kind of foreshadowing there? So you think there was more about Queen Sansa than we previously thought? Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of things about thinking about how she'll be a queen. There's her preparing for it and her thinking how she would treat people if she was in charge, and little things like learning from Cersei, just stuff that's maybe even less, that's somewhat direct, but isn't necessarily, you wouldn't even necessarily consider it foreshadowing, because of course she's learning from Cersei. She's around Cersei all the time. But also the training, what she's learning from Littlefinger teaching her how to, manipulate and intrigue and how people think and how to get what you want out of people, how to read them, how to find their weaknesses, all these things that she would use in a different way than Littlefinger, probably because she's not as cynical or as ambitious or as, evil as he is, if you want to go that far, which I think is fair. But yeah, and in Arya's case, I guess there's some fun ones too, with her thinking about sailing west and thinking about Nymeria early on. That's really fun. And as well as her fascination with all the time she spends at the docks in Braavos, I think is pretty relevant for that. But I guess that's a bit off topic.
Wait, a
little bit.
a little bit. I mean, I think my take on Sansa has always been that if we take the direwolf names as being foreshadowing of the fate of their owners, then clearly Sansa will end up a lady in some way. So I think that's her bottom mark. Above and beyond that, I think I've always felt that there were two possible outcomes for her. One is being this kind of Lady of Winterfell or Queen of the North or whatever it is that is in charge in the North, which kind of brings her full circle from the person who didn't want anything to do with the North, and the Starks wanted to go down to King's Landing, bringing her back full circle back up to Winterfell in the north. That is one thing. The other thing is I've talked about it many times, so I'm not going to get into the details, but the kind of the War of the Roses kind of feel that she was going to be the one who would marry a Lannister and bring an end to the warfare. So those are the two broad endings I would see for her. Which brings me to a slight tangent, because this was, I said at the very beginning, we talked about this a little bit in Nashville. Summer. Now, Bran's direwolf is called Summer. Now, this is something that I think we've all kind of missed. And my take on this is that, and everyone's take on this, not just me, is that the direwolf's names tell us a little bit about the fate of the people. So we get Ghost tells us that Jon's going to die and come back from the dead. Shaggy Dog tells us that Rickon's story is going to be long and convoluted, but fundamentally it's not going to be that important. Summer is not spring, is my take on this, which is, I think, the important thing that I think we perhaps as a community got wrong. If we thought that Bran's role was to bring about the end of the long night or the winter and bring about spring, surely his direwolf should have been called Spring. However, his direwolf was called Summer, which seems to imply after everything else has happened, that's his moment.
Yeah.
Well,
and that fits so well. Yeah. I love that take. I agree with you. I think it was right there. It was right there in front of us, and we didn't put the pieces together until we had this other huge piece of info to guide us. And yeah, it's great. Summer comes after spring. Like you said, you have to have spring before you have summer, and summer is the end state of the books most likely, because we'll have a dream of spring, and maybe we won't get all the way to summer, but we'll see what the state of affairs is going to be as summer comes in sometime in the future, perhaps off screen. And that's part of the aftermath. You have George has spoken a lot about how the scouring of the Shire in The Lord of the Rings is a really important development, a pivotal moment for him in understanding literature and how to write. He when he was a kid, he read that moment and was like, I don't get it. The story's over. Why, the good guys won. What's going on here? And he, of course, as age 13, this confused him. The good guys won. Why are they, why are the bad guys getting like to strike back here at the end? Well, of course, I don't know that the ending will be dark like that in Game of Thrones, but it is important to note that George values spending time on the aftermath, and we're not just going to defeat the others and be done. And he's going to have to go through all the rebuilding of the kingdoms, fixing things, and setting humanity up to be settled into a new status quo. And which is, of course, a huge part of the hero's journey, that you're getting back to a sense of normalcy. Even if it's a new normal, it's a state that's expected to continue. And having an immortal god king you could expect that to last for a while if you close the curtain with that state happening. So yeah, you're right. Grey Wind, a blur, does a lot, but isn't there for long. And Nymeria, the warrior princess who takes her people across the sea and explores new lands. That fits so well for Arya. So yeah, and if you send that logic to Bran, it really fits being the guy that's in charge of summer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're in full agreement on that one. Can I take you, B1 Mary? Thank you so much for the super chat. Can I take to a question that a few people have asked in various different ways over Patreon and Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere? Can we talk evil King Bran? Bloodraven and Leaf told him never raise the dead boy. Thoughts? So do you think that King Bran is evil? Could we describe him in that way, or neutral? Is he what do you think about the morality of King Bran?
I think there's a lot of room for Bran to be a bit corrupt, because I think that he has a lot of power, and power corrupts is not just a theme of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a theme of hundreds of thousands of stories and real life. So when he has this great power and is able to and has a need for it, meaning he's got to help fight against the darkness, that's a compelling thing to use his power for. But once the threat is gone and he just has this power and is existing amongst humanity with the ability to read minds, see the future, control animals, do all these things that we don't fully even understand, but that Bran seems to be particularly talented in, given his ability to potentially see have his father hear him through the tree, if that's what happened, and potentially to get inside Hodor, things like that, which are supposed to be, of course, the Hag and Varamir call that an abomination, but it's also something that Varamir isn't able to do very well, even though he's very powerful. So it kind of indicates that Bran is particularly strong. So not only does he have power that almost no one else has, he has an extraordinary amount of it. So if he has extreme political power and extreme magical power, it's kind of hard to imagine him not being at least a little bit subjugated by his own immensity, his own power, like corrupted by all that power. So I could see him doing some things that aren't great. I don't know about evil, but I think, because that just seems too much for me, but I think gray, if Bran ends up, that could be part of the bittersweet ending, seeing that Bran is not just this, because if you just have this benevolent god king ruler, that would be great for Westeros. If you live in Westeros and you have a benevolent god king ruler, that's better than any other monarchy system you could have, I think. Not only because you have a benevolent ruler who's out to do good, but because he'll be there for so long. He's like has an extended lifespan. So I think there's room for that. I'm not saying I'm sure it'll happen, but the opportunity is there. The reasoning is there. The logic is there. As far as human nature goes, Bran, of course, will be different. I don't think he'll be TV show Bran, where he's just so kind of muted in his personality. I think there'll be more conflict in him, and we'll see inside his head, which gives, there's a lot more room for that in the books where we can see inside his head. I think the show is a little bit limited from its medium. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for George to write conflict of Bran fighting himself to do things he shouldn't do.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the book POV chapters, I think it's been quite instructive that the number of Bran chapters we've had have been coming down. I can't remember how many there were in the last book. It was only like 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think it's 3. It might be 4.
Yeah, but, and it's just like, it will get harder and harder. I mean, George R. R. Martin is clearly a fantastic writer, but it will get harder and harder to write from the POV of a character who can access any information and time across the world, and potentially has many, many different beings and experiences within him. So I think that will get a lot harder for him to do. I do think that it's quite likely that the last chapter is going to be Bran's. But I do not think that the major driving force of the story is going to be Bran. I think we're going to see what he does more than experience it through his POV. That's just my gut instinct in terms of what's going to be happening with the books. And in terms of is Bran, or would King Bran be evil? I think we have to take George R. R. Martin's overall take on characters here, which is that characters aren't just here are the good guys, there are the bad guys. There are shades of grey in between all of the different characters, and some people will be trying to do what they think is right, that you might take a step back and go, well, I'm not 100% sure that I agree that is the right thing to do. So Melisandre, for example, probably the most extreme example, is 100% convinced that she's doing what is right. She is convinced that everything that she does, yes, it might in and of itself not be a good thing, but it's in order to save humanity, for the greater good and all the rest of it. Bloodraven has that very same attitude, is that what he does for the good of the realm. he does for the good of Westeros. And so I think that we can see that approach being taken forward by King Bran. And we'll get on in a moment to the other question of, is this Bran or is this Bloodraven or the Weirwood Network or whoever? But I think we will see that kind of approach of for the greater good being taken forward into King Bran, which means that he will think that he is doing good, but we might think actually it's slightly more nuanced than that.
Well said.
Thank you very much.
By the way, you were right. 3 Bran chapters in A Dance with Dragons, and I looked just as a count for the rest of them. It's 7 in A Game of Thrones, 7 in A Clash of Kings, 4 in A Storm of Swords, none in Feast, and 3. So there's 7 in the first 2 books, and only 7 total after that.
Yeah, it's coming down for a main character. It's noticeable that he's having less and less. I mean, on the show they cut him out for a season, but I think it will be harder to write that character. Let's get one more question before just asking you what you've got coming up on your channel.
All right.
Let's go with Lady J, and I think this is a question really that you might have a good answer to as you've been rereading. Great. Saying, not only am I interested in the foreshadowing about King Bran, but I also wonder if he repeatedly says in the books that I can never be Lord of anything, as he did in the show. Because in the show he was very clear, I can't do this isn't me, and all the rest of it. Is there anything there in the books where he is personally thinking that he can't be king? And PJ, incidentally, hi PJ, added onto that over on Patreon saying, I agree with you on the showrunners letting us down with conversations always steering Bran away from ever caring about being a title bearer. So in the books, is he that clear about, I don't think I'm ever going to be a king or lord or anything like that?
I don't think so. He's definitely laments his loss of his legs, for sure. He hates that. He is, traumatized by it. Why wouldn't he be? But he's more broken up about not broken up. No pun intended. But he's, of course, that's important too. He's the only person that thinks of that phrase. Bran the Broken is something he thinks of himself. He doesn't say that phrase out loud, as far as I can recall. And I don't think anyone else refers to him as that. But he does think a lot about being a knight and how he can't be a knight anymore, which I think is interesting because one of the first things he does, in I think it's his 2nd or maybe 3rd chapter, he thinks about the Kingsguard. And that's really neat because he always wanted to be a Kingsguard, but instead he's going to have to pick a Kingsguard if he's going to be king. So it's kind of a subtle way for George tying those elements together without us seeing why. Of course, he's a young boy fascinated by knighthood. That's just normal. That's like fits pretty well without any explanation. And of course, the most famous knights are the Knights of the Kingsguard, so it makes sense that he would be interested in them. But it obscures his relationship to the Kingsguard is something else in this sense. In addition to, actually, I just thought of something related to an earlier question. I'll throw this out here real quick. When you talked about the seat, being in the seat in the weirwood throne, when Bran is when the scene where Bran and Robb meet Tyrion as he's coming back from the wall, and Robb is kind of hostile towards him. First of all, it's pretty meaningful that Robb is sitting there just like one of the Stone Kings in the high seat of Winterfell with his sword across his lap. That's kind of foreshadowing his death. Of course, there's lots of foreshadowing for Robb's death. That's nothing new. But Robb gets up, and Bran is placed in that seat by Hodor, and that's interesting, having Robb standing beside him and Bran being the one sitting in the throne, or not the throne, but the high seat of Winterfell. And yeah, so I don't think of him. I'm not aware of him lamenting that he'll never be Lord or King. Other people say that he won't be the Lord of Winterfell because he can't have heirs, but even that isn't discussed much or at all. Like Ned thinks about how he can't have heirs, but he doesn't. There's no like outright Bran can't be Lord of Winterfell. No, I don't think there's anything like that either from him or his other, because it's not true. He can be. He's the only reason people aren't considering him is because everybody thinks he's dead. That's why he's out of the line of succession. That's why Sansa becomes so part of the reason Sansa's claim becomes so important, because there's no male Starks left. But as we know, there are male Starks left. It's not just Rickon, but Bran. Bran is fully eligible to be Lord of Winterfell. In the show, he says he doesn't want it. He doesn't, he passes on it, which maybe he'll do in the books as well. But as far as the law goes, it's his, and we see him play that role in the beginning of Clash of Kings when Robb is gone. He sits in the high seat. He acts like a prince. He listens to Wyman Manderly asking permission to build ships and mint coins and to marry Lady Hornwood, and the Umbers demand this and that. And he does all these things that are, he's standing in for a lord, and it's the same sort of thing, practicing to be king. So I think I've gone off on a bit of a tangent again, but these things happen, right?
We love your tangents. This is all good. And on a complete tangent that I'm not going to follow down, but I just loved the comment. John St. Baptiste, I had your comment over on Patreon. We will get to that in a moment. But your comment in the chat saying Rickon eats Ramsay is my headcanon. I love that. So Aziz, I said I'd give you the opportunity to let us know what's going on History of Westeros and your sort of online life. What can we look forward to?
Right on. Well, we have... we're doing our every Sunday at 3 Eastern. We do Valar Rereadus, which is we're going through about 7 chapters a week of Game of Thrones. It'll be 6 for Clash of Kings because of the way the math works out on the number of chapters and the number of pages. Game of Thrones has the shortest chapters of all the books. So, we did all the math. Game of Thrones has the longest, Feast has shortest. Game of Thrones, Feast has the longest. No one's probably surprised by Feast having the longest chapters. But so we're doing that every Sunday, and we're about to start Clash of Kings in a couple of weeks. We're right at the end of Game of Thrones right now, so that's cool. But we're also now that we're over the hump of conventions, which is like convention season is a thing nowadays. So we're done with all that. We're preparing. We're getting ready to put out a bunch more scripted content, which is our main thing. And that'll start off with House Blackwood episode, History of House Blackwood, what's coming and what's already come. And then we're doing an episode on Lomas Longstrider. And we're doing a collaboration with Radio Westeros on the Dance of the Dragons. So that's kind of an ongoing intermittent project. And we hope to deliver that, by the end of the year. And so, yeah, lots of stuff.
Excellent. And for those who don't know, Radio Westeros is Lady Gwyn, who was on this channel a couple of weeks ago, and Yoke Boy, they're a fantastic podcast and YouTube channel. I would highly recommend. And for those who've not stumbled across Aziz before, then I only, as you know, invite people on here if I would personally recommend their channel. And Aziz and Ashaya with History of Westeros are one of the central points of this Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire community, and I would highly recommend you check out what they do. There is a link down in the description, and I'm sure my moderators will put one in the chat if you're watching this live. In terms, I would like to very quickly come back in a moment to your conferences and conventions trips, because you had a lot of time to interact with the great man George R. R. Martin himself, which I'd very much be interested in your thoughts and reflections on that. But I'll just very quickly say what's coming up here on this channel. So on In Deep Geek, I've been slightly lower on content over the summer. It's been quite a busy summer for me, but we're going to be building that back up. So getting back into Song of Ice and Fire content. Also on Hobbit Day later this month, then I will be starting my Lord of the Rings content.
Nice.
I will be starting with a look at what is the Second Age, the Amazon series, the huge budget, ridiculous budget Lord of the Rings series is going to be set in the Second Age of Middle Earth, and the question I'm asking is, what is the Second Age? What does that mean? Which characters are going to be in there? Where might it be based? What kind of stories might we be looking at? So coming up in a couple of weeks is going to be the start of my Lord of the Rings content too. My second channel, Morally very kindly talked about it. The Well Told Tale is it's my passion project, really. It's me just reading audiobooks, what I consider to be the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. So at the minute, we're halfway through At the Mountains of Madness, which is an H.P. Lovecraft story in the world of Cthulhu. We're sort of 3 out of 5 or 6 sections going through that. Each time it's like averaging about 3/4 of an hour, just me reading the story. So it's just an audiobook. If you're interested in that, there's a link again down in the description to The Well Told Tale. And the final thing that I would just say is that for about 2 years now, people have been badgering me for merch. I'm finally getting onto it, guys. So if you want in Deep Geek mugs, then keep an eye out. This is a little trailer. It will be happening soon. But Aziz, you have been at conventions across the world, as has George R.R. Martin. He's probably not badged it as such, but he's taken a month off from writing, which is entirely fine. And you met him a couple of times. What came out from that? What was your impressions? Did you get any insights, information, anything that you can like share that you think would be really interesting?
Yeah, certainly. I've definitely attended several events with him. I've met him at conventions going back to, I think, 2014. And he's a really down-to-earth guy. The first time we met him, he just, it's a normal thing to have parties at hotel rooms and conventions. People throw little room parties to gather, 10 or 20 people in their room. And Ashay and I were just in a room, and he just walked in. Just walked into someone's hotel room to hang out, sat down, grabbed a beer, sat down in the corner. The room just kind of went, everybody shifted where they were. Their arrangements sort of formed a half circle around him. And he just told stories about conventions. So in Ireland, this was the 77th Worldcon. That's where we were for 12 days. And we got to see a lot of the filming locations. George did too. He went to the Game of Thrones touring exhibit. He's interested in these things. He likes to see all that. But we did get to sit down with him at lunch, even in a small group. And that included a bunch of us singing Jenny's song to him. That was led by one of his assistants, brought it up on YouTube, and we all sang along. That was fun. And he, didn't really want to talk about season 8. We didn't ask, of course, but his assistants were kind of, directing people away who tried to come up and would ask him for a picture, because he's very generous with his signatures, but he doesn't like to take pictures with people as much. He'll do it occasionally, but not while he's just sitting there eating. That's not the right time to ask for that. And if anyone would ever ask, well, blah blah blah, season 8, they'd be like, no, not necessarily that he wants to can it or anything. Maybe he does, but he just doesn't want to talk about it. He's done. He's explained himself to his friends probably, and is like, yeah, I don't need to keep talking about that. But we did one fun thing was there was a small event with about 120 people at the spot where most of the Winterfell scenes are filmed, where the spot called Castle Ward, and there was another Q&A. Now over the years we've been to enough Q&As with George to try to come up with a strategy. You don't want to ask a question that he can wander off and go off on a tangent, like in these live streams, we go off on tangents. We don't, that's time you don't want the tangents, even though the tangents can be really interesting because it's coming from George, and just about anything he says has potential to be interesting. But if you want your question answered, you have to kind of make it succinct and focused, kind of thing he can't wiggle out of, the kind of thing he can't go off. So that's why we asked him about did Bloodraven take Dark Sister to the wall? That was a good example of a question that's succinct. It's a yes or no question that isn't too revealing. If you ask me, people would ask him back in the day. People would say, "Hey, George, who are Jon Snow's parents?" And of course, he's not gonna answer that. That's a silly question. You've wasted your question. Nowadays, he's moving away from the microphone questions. People don't get to just walk up at a Q&A and ask him a question. It's more likely to be done in writing now. So I submitted a question at this event: what was the oldest castle in Westeros? And that got answered. He had to think about it. He said, oldest castle in Westeros. That's interesting. He said it's probably Winterfell, but it depends on what you consider a castle. Casterly Rock you might consider when it was just a cave that had a lion in it. And once the the Casterlys went in there and got that lion out and put a door on that cave, is it a castle yet? When is it at what point?
Or the High Tower.
Right, at the High Tower. That we thought he might say that one, but maybe he doesn't consider that one a castle. I don't know. Maybe he just didn't think of that as an option. But so I would have. That's certainly would have one of my top picks for what I thought he would say. But anyway, as far as his writing style, his process, he says he needs to get momentum. But he also really wants the books to be good. He really wants the ending to be strong. He wants to nail the landing. He knows how important it is. He doesn't want to disappoint people, and he's certainly not going to abandon it or anything. I know there's some small subset of the fandom worry that he's just going to give up on it, which I really don't think that's the case. He really seems to want it. He genuinely has a passion to see this delivered and be good. But that's also why he's taking care with it, because he wants it to be good. You can't rush that. So, and it's harder. It's more complicated than it was when it was just one book or two books or three books. He has more moving pieces, more characters to juggle, more plot lines to make sure he wraps up and to make sure they gel together and they work together. So that means writing them and then looking back on them and reviewing that. Hey, is this actually good? Is this going to work? Because sometimes it's good, but it doesn't work. Sometimes it works, but it isn't good. So there's just so much to deal with. So, there's nothing super revealing about his plans. He's guarded with that. Even his assistants don't know most of the stuff. He keeps it on the down low. And
he did. I think at the London event, he did reveal what his current plans were in terms of the order of what he was going to be writing.
Yeah, that was neat.
Which, off the top of my head, was The Winds of Winter is next, then a Dunk and Egg story, then A Dream of Spring, then another Dunk and Egg story, and then Fire and Blood Part 2, and then probably more Dunk and Egg stories. Which I was quite excited by because I love the Dunk and Egg stories, and I think that he loves writing them too. But it made me think that, okay, so actually we'll probably, because the Dunk and Egg stories are quite short, we'll probably get the next one of them quite soon after the Winds of Winter. So it might well be that whenever we get the Winds of Winter, we'll get a Dunk and Egg story happening 6 months or so after that, which I got quite excited by. So just quickly picking up on a couple of thoughts in the chat. People saying about other great Lord of the Rings channels. There are a lot of fantastic Lord of the Rings channels. Men of the West is indeed good, as people are talking about there in the chat. I'd highly recommend that. If you're into Lord of the Rings, go and check that out. The Philosopher's Game is also very good, and there are quite a few others. I'm in contact with those guys. Hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit of collaboration going on. And in terms of The Witcher, yes, I have. Somebody was asking whether I've read The Witcher books. I've read the first 3 of them, so not quite enough, I think, for when season 1 of The Witcher comes out for me to be as authoritative as I would like to be in terms of making content about it. So season 1 of The Witcher I will not be covering here on this channel, but I would highly recommend you go and check out people who will be. I know that JR on Geek Chat 1 will definitely be doing it. I think that Kyle Azora Hype will be doing it, and probably a few others as well. So do go and check that out. Okay, so let's quickly go to a super chat from Stephen Stark saying, why do we think Bran is immortal? I'll quickly answer this from my perspective, and then Aziz, if you come in after that. So I don't think I've ever said that I think he's immortal. I know that a lot of people do hold that view. I think where, in terms of his longevity, where I come from is by looking at Bloodraven's cave, and what seems to be the case there is that Bloodraven clearly is very old. and has been there a while, and he seems to be sustained by the weirwood network, by the weirwood roots that are not just like hugging him, but sort of going through him and sustaining him. He has been sucked up within the weirwood network. And when Bran goes exploring through those caves, through Hodor, then he sees that there are what look like children of the forest also hooked up to the weirwood network, and they're even more ancient and decrepit than Bloodraven appears to be. So my take is that if you are hooked up to the weirwood network, then you can survive for a very long time. We don't know how long. I suspect it's not immortal, but you become part of the network itself and your physical body does carry on. So that's my take. But have you got any other thoughts on Bran's longevity or immortality?
I basically agree with you. I don't think he's immortal. I think unless you think of in a pretty metaphysical way, like if he becomes part of the weirwood network gradually, then in a sense he's never gone. But as a functioning human body, yeah, that's not going to be forever. But I do think he would have an extended life. I mean, Bloodraven still has a sort of functioning human body. There's parts of it that function. He still has an eyeball, you know.
Yeah.
And he would be 125 years old at this point. So, you know, older than anyone else that isn't magically enhanced. Like Melisandre is probably old as well. But yeah, that's obviously magic also. So yeah, so I agree with you. I don't think immortal is taking it too far, I think, unless you look at it in philosophical terms. But his body, he won't be king. He won't be an immortal king. He'll just last longer, I would suspect.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And Turbo, thank you so much for the super sticker. I'm still getting used to this idea of super stickers, but thank you so much for that. That's very kind, with just like a little smiley tongue sticky outy face. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Super stickers still slightly confuse me, guys, so apologies if I'm trying to get up to speed with them. Let's go back to some questions. So we've been talking a little bit about this. Is it really Bran? So Ben Androvich says, do you think King Bran has any Bran Stark left in him? Since Bran is very young and new to his Greenseer abilities, do you think the older and more experienced Greenseers, such as Bloodraven, have taken over his consciousness? And the context of that question, says Ben, is about whether Bloodraven never made a push to be king because he knew that he was always going to be king later on, by being kind of assimilated into the weirwood network. So what's your take? Is the Bran that we see at the end of the show, and we think it's going to be some sort of version of that happening in the books, do you think that is actually Bran, or is it like an amalgam of the weirwood network in some way?
I think it's mostly Bran. I do think there's some amalgam in there, but I don't really subscribe to the, that he's Bloodraven's taken him over or anything like that. I think there is definitely influence. He's part of the weirwood network, or will be, and I think that impacts him, but I think he's still mostly himself. I don't say that with a super high degree of confidence, but I also, as someone who's put a lot of effort into studying Bloodraven's life as a mortal, he just doesn't strike me as the kind of person that would take Bran over, unless it was to save people, to save the world, to save the realm. I think he's a means and ends justify the means kind of guy. He'll do whatever it takes to achieve his goals, but his goals aren't self-serving. He had plenty of opportunities to gain power and didn't, other than political power, which he certainly had lots of. But he never enriched himself, never made him, used his power for personal gain in that sense. So some of the evil Bloodraven theories don't work for me because of the way I perceive his personality. But I do think there's room for him to think it's necessary. And that is where I find some agreement with people who think that there might be more to it in terms of Bran being overly influenced, to put it mildly, or if not more, by Bloodraven or perhaps other elements within the weirwood network that are even older than him. You know, that kind of unseen. Like we said, the old gods are vengeful. The North remembers. We have blood sacrifice in their history. We don't know exactly where this is going, but a lot of it's pretty damn dark. I mean, that cave, Bloodraven's cave, the down there is creepy. This is skulls everywhere, and yeah, that's that's not it's not your happy fun palace, you know. I think your audio's off.
How's that? That's better
Yep,
now.
there you go.
Sorry about that, guys. No, I'm just going to say this is one of the things that, in terms of brainwashing a child, and Bran is just a child. It's one of the biggest things that you think. Okay, so he's arrived here at a cave literally just filled with bones to see an old man with roots sticking through his eyes and then like decrepit ancient bodies hooked up to trees. This is really weird. And the fact that he's got to this point and is not completely freaked out, I think, shows the extent of the it depends on how you wish to view it, the training or the brainwashing that got him that far. So yeah, it's my take is that he is not going to be completely subsumed, so he's not Bran anymore, but he will be a part of the weirwood network. He will be like the driver of a car with a huge amount of other people in it. That's where I kind of see it. Bloodraven is there and will continue to be there. I think that his physical body probably will be killed in the same way or a similar way to on the show, allowing Bran to come down as being this kind of like the owner of the Green Seer mantle. So I don't think this is just Bloodraven being Bran, but I think it's not just Bran. I think he is subsumed within the weirwood network as a whole. That's my kind of take on what's going on there.
Like it.
Stephen Lucy, thank you so much for the super chat, saying, as a thank you for properly getting me into the books and for all the hours upon hours of great content here and on the Well Told Tale. Thank you so much. Also, hype for Yorkshire tea in IDG mugs. Thank you so much. The mugs are coming, guys. I promise you that. That's the one thing that people have been consistently asking me for is in Deep Geek mugs. And I can assure you there will be at least 2 different types of mugs, black mugs and white mugs. We're going to be quite basic to start with, but we'll work our way up from it. Let's go with a question from John St. Baptiste. Hi there, John. I saw you in the chat saying, no joke, I remember thinking that Bran would become king in some form, either of Westeros or the North, at the end of the first book. That being said, most will agree that the ending in the show was haphazardly put together due to time constraints. If Bran ascends to the throne in the books, how do you think it would logically play out? So I think this is quite a fundamental question, is that we've been talking in the theoretical or the abstract about this idea of King Bran, whether there's foreshadowing for it, how it might happen, what he might be. How might it actually happen? Is it going to be in roughly the same way, do you think, that we saw on the show, that he just kind of survives to the end and then Tyrion says, hey, you know what, Bran would be a great king? Is it going to be that simple, or is it going to be slightly different?
Or it's different. I mean, it's it's too hard for it to be the same. You know, there has to be some small differences. That's a tough one. I'd be curious to hear your answer on that.
Well, so my take is that it, as with most of these things, the ending, it's almost as if George R. R. Martin would have said to them, so Bran ends up king as a result of there being a great council. And then the showrunners figured out how to get to there. Now, the Great Council is not going to look the same as it did on the show, because
right.
frankly, there are like so many extra people who are more important than, in terms of politically important than, Brienne of Tarth or Sam Tarly or whoever else that will be involved in this decision. But I could certainly see a situation in which there is a Great Council. The place for a Great Council is probably more likely, given what we've heard from Fire and Blood and the sort of the general history of World of Ice and Fire. Harrenhal seems to be a more logical place to be holding the Great Council rather than King's Landing in the Dragon Pit. It would not surprise me if King Bran emerges from that, as frankly, if you just looked at the geopolitics of who's left on the show, which is going to be roughly the same as in the books, who is it who could be king? Of the characters who are there, actually, if you say nobody's going to vote for Edmure Tully, nobody's going to vote for Sweet Robin, Sansa's happy being up in the north, John's going to recuse himself and say he's not going to do it. Actually, you're going to start running out of candidates. And Bran coming through as the most likely person does kind of make sense to me. So my general take, and I did a video a couple of weeks ago about things that I think that are going to be the same in the books as they were in the show. I'm working on a video of things that I think are going to be different, but my overall take is that the big beats, as George R. R. Martin calls them, the big beats, the endings are going to be the same for the main characters. It's just that the context might be slightly different. So I think Bran will become king. I think he will become king through some sort of great council. It won't look the same as it did on the show.
I agree with that. I think that there's a couple other fun things to tie to this, just to add some detail. I mostly agree with you. Well, I completely agree with you. I'll just add a few things. George loves to put these major historical events in the past, many or most of which are foreshadowing. The Dance of the Dragons is a foreshadowing for Aegon or Fagon versus Dany, Fagon / Young Griff, whatever you think he is. Doesn't matter whether you think he's real or not. The point is there will be a conflict between them. And likewise, you have the young dragon foreshadowing the young wolf, little things like that. And there's two major great councils that get a lot of page time in the history books and a little bit in the main novels as well. And who ran the last great council 70 years ago? Bloodraven. So it's like, well, there you go. And it came about because of so many other Targaryens died and people didn't want egg. And they quietly offered it to Aemon first, which is a wonderful parallel to what we see with Jon in the show, because Jon has a lot of parallels to Maester Aemon. So since Maester Aemon was offered the crown and refused it, Jon had his "I don't want it" moment. So that just lines up perfectly. All these things line up so beautifully. You have Bran being mentored by Bloodraven, and then a great council in the past where Bloodraven is in charge of it, and it ends up selecting Egg. And then you have kind of the same situation where there just wasn't really another good candidate. Like Egg was the best candidate by far. It was just that people didn't want him. There were nobles who didn't like him because they thought he was spoiled from spending too much time around the commoners. From their perspective, they were right, but not from an ethical perspective. But they were right that Egg would be bad for them. But that's not the point. Bran. So Bran kind of fits this parallel in a lot of it really well. So I expect a great council to happen, partly because there were two in history and they were so important. And that seems, because of so many other things like that, have turned out to be foreshadowing. There's a good chance this one is too. So there's historical support for it. There's a lot of parallels. If it does happen, it would line up really well with things that we kind of expect. So that doesn't mean it'll happen, but I feel pretty strongly that it will. So yeah, I'm very much with you there on that.
Yeah. I mean, so I think we're broadly agreed that it will happen in roughly the same way. In that, so Bran is going to be stuck north of the wall for a while, not stuck, doing his training. He will come back down south of the wall. He will have some involvement, I suspect, about the denouement with the others, the White Walkers, but his main focus will be on this last bit about him becoming king through a great council, because everything is going to be decimated and everyone's going to be looking around and go, well, who now? Who's going to rule us now? And that's the point at which they will need to decide. And the precedent they've got in terms of governance of Westeros is to have a great council, get everybody together, and then let everybody decide who's going to be ruler. Morley asked about who's going to be doing Bran's training. Now, is it just in the books? Is it just going to be Bloodraven? Or are we going to see Mira and Jojen playing a role? What about Cold Hands? Who do you think is going to be the important people in this training of Bran north of the wall and then south of the wall?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
So we're talking about training.
Yeah.
So on the show, basically it was Bloodraven, whether you call it training or not, that he was the person who was showing him
the
stuff.
mentor. Yeah.
In the books, we've obviously got a whole load of extra characters. There's Mira and Jojen. Now, I suspect we agree on Jojen Paste here, that Jojen's role is probably done. But what about Mira and Cold Hands? Will they play a role in his training as well? Or how about Howland Reed?
Howland Reed's super interesting. That's the hardest one of those. I think Cold Hands, no. I think Cold Hands is... My personal belief on Cold Hands was that he was one of the Raven's Teeth, because Bloodraven was lost beyond the wall. Lots of the Raven's Teeth took the black when he did. And if he's going to go out ranging and he's Lord Commander, gets to pick who goes with him, you'd think he would pick some of those guys that he knows best, that he's trusted for so long. So I kind of believe it that way. Mira, she's less of a mentor and more of a companion, I think. I definitely think she's taught him, for sure, because she's older and wiser than him. But I think that for the most part, she's run out of things to teach him, other than maybe some stuff about attitudes and just being a decent person. But she can't teach him magic, or he's not going to learn how to fight at all. I don't think that's in his destiny. But she, as a companion, she's really important. But yeah, I don't know about having a whole lot more to teach him. Howland Reed, though, that's a really interesting one, because if you guys recall, Jojen and Mira were sent to Bran after Howland heard about Jojen's dream, and with the three-eyed crow. So he knows he's not just the Tower of Joy that he has information on. That little bit alone reveals he has some understanding of magic, knowledge about it, and the fact that he went to the Isle of Faces before the Tournament of Harrenhal is like a big Chekhov's, I don't know, magic wand. I don't know what you want to call that. Chekhov's weirwood. Chekhov's heart tree. Let's go with that. Yeah. So he's likely to be one of the most knowledgeable about old gods stuff, magic wise, than anyone other than Bloodraven or the children themselves. And boy, he's just out there. We're waiting for him to appear on screen. The show didn't bother to use him, but the show didn't bother to do a lot of the magical stuff. That's a major thing they just cut out. They just like, magic, we're going to keep that to a minimum. Something we all have to really look forward to in the books is the fact that, well, we don't know how that's going to go. It was almost entirely removed from the show. So while it would have been fun to see it on the show, on the other hand, well, something to look forward to that we really can be surprised by, something we don't know what's coming. There's a lot that the show didn't cover that's still to come in the books, by the way. You know that, but I love to repeat that. It's a lot.
Yeah, and Howland Reed, I could talk about Howland Reed for a long time. So he will return. George R. R. Martin has confirmed that he will return in the books. Now, he is, at a very basic level, he's Bloodraven's man on the ground. I'm going to do a video, probably the last video in my series on Robert's Rebellion and all of that, will be on what the role of Bloodraven and Howland Reed actually is, because they are working in tandem I believe, to a large degree.
Nice.
And so what Howland Reed's role is going to be will be to appear, and he will be able to firstly say what happened back in the day with the Tower of Joy and Jon's birth and all the rest of it. And secondly, he is going to be the person who will be able to explain how to do the weirwood magic. Whether Bran needs it when he gets back down there is a different matter. But he is going to be a person who is the only other person that we could theoretically see train Bran after he has moved back down south again. So that's where he's important, because he will have been for a couple of decades now. He's been the person who can hook himself up to the Weirwood network and get himself connected to what's going on there with this sort of larger plan with the Children of the Forest and what they're all trying to do.
Yeah, well said.
Talking of which, I said we would come back to this one. This is another Maura Lee question. Do you see Bran ruling over Westeros at the Isle of Faces rather than King's Landing? This is something that we all agree on the importance of the Isle of Faces. Clearly, this is some kind of hub, central point for the Weirwood network. Clearly, there's a huge historical point going on there with the pact between humanity, the First Men, and the Children of the Forest. There seems to have been a lot of symbolism that I kind of saw as symbolism anyway, in Fire and Blood and other things, about there being dragon battles above it and things like that.
Yeah.
And then you get the random comments like the one I was talking about earlier, when Arya's just saying no gods are coming to to Harrenhal. Everything in this story, they didn't pick up on it in the show really, but everything in the story seems to be around this, like these few miles about the Isle of Faces, Harrenhal, the inn at the crossroads. All of the important things seem to be happening. The Ruby Ford seem to be happening around that area. Do you think that as Bran is clearly going to be a Weirwood king, a Greenseer king in some way, he will actually base himself at the Isle of Faces rather than King's Landing?
I think it's a good chance, yeah. Because in part it would, if there's power in those trees, which I think there probably is, given what we've seen people like the Ghost of Highheart linger amongst the stumps. We've seen the awe and the power that may or may not be, that at least certainly the awe and the wonder in the 9 Weirwood Grove north of the Wall where they say their vows. And so I think there's something to that. Also, there's just a good chance King's Landing is toast. So there, if King's Landing is burned to the ground, then it's just not a very viable spot to set up your capital. And if he's worried about protecting himself, like if he's, from a securities perspective, sitting on that island isn't the most accessible place for people to, to hold court, but he maybe isn't concerned with that. Maybe he just wants to stay isolated. So that's tough to theorize about. It's not one of those things you can just say, oh, this is a really strong theory. There's a lot of cool ideas that I think work, and that's one of them. I think that works really well. But it's just so mysterious, and it seems like it seems a little sort of high magic-y, which nothing against that, but maybe that's a slight strike against it, but not necessarily. So yeah, I like it.
I mean, there's a practicality issue in terms of him ruling from the Isle of Faces, because actually what? So the small council's going to come and move up there as well. Where are all his advisors going to be, and all the rest of it? So there's definitely that. I do, and I was reading again over on Twitter. Ravenous Reader was telling me about this quote from A Dance with Dragons. I don't know where it was from, but this is a Bran POV when he says, "Who is he now? Is he lord of a burned castle, heir to ruins?" And I was suggesting that that was King's Landing in the context of season 8, but lord of a burned castle is also Harrenhal.
Harrenhal, yeah.
Which is that is the castle burned by dragons. That's what it's known for. So it's in there are a lot of possibilities here. That when we're talking about foreshadowing, it's not clear, and I think that we shouldn't. Where we started all of this is with these kind of caveats and trying to figure out what we do with all of this kind of new foreshadowing that we've all spotted. And it is when we start getting the weight of it, when we start being able to say, okay, it's not just that there's one passing reference to Bran being king, or to Bran being the Isle of Faces. Once we start getting 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, that's the point at which we start going, okay, so this isn't just a random bit of sort of literary flourish from George R. R. Martin. This is actually something he's trying to hint at. So I think we've got about 10, 15 more minutes, guys. I've got a couple more questions from my patrons, but now's the moment to drop any more questions over in the chat. We'll try and pick up on as many of them as we possibly can. Can I ask you a question which I'm going to throw to you first, because it's one that I don't know the answer to readily. I go to and fro on this a lot. This was a morally question about Bran's role in defeating the others.
Okay.
In the books versus the show. Have you spotted, and where we've been going with this is this idea that Bran's role, we thought it was in defeating the White Walkers, but actually it's more to do with him ruling afterwards, ruling in summer, not in ending winter. Have you seen any kind of hints about what his role might be vis-a-vis the others?
I think that is a bit of a divergence from the books, if not, or from the show, if not a large divergence, because from the very early on, Bran is told in his coma dream that this is, this is why you have to live, because winter is coming. He's not told he has to live because after winter is coming, someone will need to pick up the pieces. Though that is maybe a fair interpretation. If he's Bran the Builder, think of him as Bran the Rebuilder. Westeros will be devastated, not only by, even if we imagine King's Landing destroyed by fire, it doesn't matter who does it, whether it's Dany, John Connington, or some combination of both, doesn't matter. If it's destroyed, if we have other places destroyed, Winterfell might be taken out. I don't suspect the others will be defeated at Winterfell. I just think that's too easy. I think I agree with you and others. I think that final battle with humanity facing the others will be at Harrenhal. That's the spot where they have all the room for it. It's where Dany sees her vision of melting an army of ice at the river, which is the Trident. So that seems to fit better. Having it culminate near the God's Eye makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that works really well for me in that sense. It fits. But also, by the way, as a small aside, I like you mentioned the dragons fighting over the God's Eye. I think that's that could fit really well too, especially the idea of what we see. We see an undead dragon on TV. I think it'll be very different, but the idea of an undead dragon, I think we could have. When we see Caraxes crawl back out of the water after he and Vhagar kill each other, to me, that could be where that's leading. The whole point of that would be to have a dragon come back out of the lake, risen from the dead. Yeah. But there we go with another tangent.
And I think it's a good one. I think that regardless of how it happens, and I think there are a few different options, but regardless of how it happens, Daenerys is not going to retain control over all 3 of her dragons going into the last.
The horn could work too, exactly. For example.
Yeah,
but To be a little more direct with answering the question, I think he'll have a bigger role, and I think one of the reasons they didn't give him a bigger role is the same thing we just said a minute ago. So they stripped a lot of the magic out, and how telling Bran's story from inside his head, it was a real challenge for them. But if Bran is skin changing and using magic from his own POV that we can see inside his head, well, that's a little more presentable in a book than it is on TV, where it just kind of looks like he's casting spells or something like that. It just would be weird, I think. Not that what they did wasn't weird also, but that would just be a different kind of weird. So yeah, I think he'll definitely have more of an active role during the war, but still probably, I do think that the show is telling us that his role will be less active than we thought. I think we could at least glean that much from it.
Yeah,
but it won't be nothing.
No, it won't. And I mean, I'm being generous to the show, perhaps, but Bran's role was to set things in place for the end of the threat from the White Walkers. So what he did on the show was he gave the dagger to Arya. And then he made sure that he was in the right place, so that they didn't explain it particularly well if you read a little bit of what the showrunner said afterwards. But this wasn't a matter of just killing the Night King; it was a matter of undoing the magic of the Night King, and that meant that a Valyrian steel blade had to be plunged into his heart at the exact same place that the dragon glass had been plunged into his heart, in front of a weirwood tree, and that would undo the magic. That was what they were trying to tell us was happening, not just Arya killing him. So I think that we can see Bran, with his understanding of everything that happened, I think that he may well be the person who goes back in time to understand exactly what's been going on, and therefore figuring out what is the way to end this threat from the others, which is not going to be just killing the Night King, because the Night King, maybe we will get the Night King in the books, but we haven't got that character yet. It will be something slightly more nuanced and slightly more focused in on how do we undo the magic, rather than how do we kill the big bad guy. So
I agree. Yeah, that's really well said. But I think to add to that, I think it's perfect what you said, because a long-held theory, that one that I like a lot, is that it's going to be Jon going north to actually execute this plan, that maybe Bran is the one who figures out what needs to be done, but Jon carries it out. And the reason being is that because Jon is dead, he can handle the extreme cold of the far north, whereas no one else could. I don't think. I mean, at least not right now. Maybe there'll be more whites, good guy whites.
Melisandre can handle the cold. She can do that.
That's a good point. So there's a few others maybe they could go with him, but yeah, to go to the heart of winter, or whatever it is, to undo this magic, to undo this spell, or whatever it is, to set the seasons right, to make this, all that. Yeah, Bran won't be the one to execute that plan. I agree with that. And Jon, to me, Jon's the best candidate. But you're right, Melisandre, that's a good example. Melisandre could be someone that's part of that.
We have a couple of excellent creators in the chat. I just want to very quickly say hi. Joe Magician, who's been on here a few times, is there throwing a little bit of shade in the chat, but I will let him go, because that's fine.
That's his method,
and Amanda, the Disputed Lands, is also there. Great to see you, Amanda.
Hey, Amanda.
Somebody earlier said that Joe Magician has got an excellent video on this very subject. I can well believe it. I haven't watched it, but everything that Joe Magician does is magic. Kyle, lovely to see you. Can you now get out of the shot, mate? Thank you.
Hey, Steven Stark also. He's got his channels going these days. In fact,
Steven
his
Stark
next guest is also here.
His next guest is that Jinx. Yes. Absolutely. Well, she's
the camera. Hello. Okay.
Pop in.
Lovely to see you, Jinx. I will see you at Con of Thrones. Okay, we're on the edges of losing control of this. So so let's just round this one up. But I think I will double check if I've had any more super chats we need to be answering. I think we've covered them all now. But why don't you do a sort of an overview of where you think we're at now in terms of the community as a whole in understanding what Bran's role is going forward in the books compared to where we thought it was 6 months ago?
6 months ago. Yeah, I mean, so much has changed. It's crazy. I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of arguing or debating, hopefully debating over barguing. It's both. It's a combination of the two of what from the show is accurate, and what isn't. But I mean, I think it makes sense to take kind of a Zen approach to it. Say, well, it might be. A lot of them probably are. A lot of them probably aren't. Like you gave some good examples of things that clearly aren't going to be in the show or aren't going to be in the books. Like anytime you have a character that was combined into two characters combined into one, like Gendry and Edric Storm are basically one character in the show. Perfect example of something that's clearly going to be different, even if there's some serious similarities there. And yeah. So Bran, I think, is perhaps one of the best examples of that concept of there being a divide on whether it's going to be true. But I think the reaction, there's a lot of surprise and people doubting it. But over the preceding months since then, it's more and more people have accepted it. I think there's been more of a, actually, as we've all spent more time looking through the books and looking for more evidence of it, I think more and more people are accepting it and realizing, this and some of these other things are probably accurate. But but like we said before, there's so much that's going to be different as well. I don't know. I maybe started that question off immediately on a tangent rather than
style. Don't worry about it. Just go
rather
with
than
it.
devolving into one. I just went straight to it, rushed to the tangent. Well, we don't have much time left, so I had to. Well, but I want to hear your answer to that too.
I mean, I think my take looking back is that Bran has always been the character that we've most, out of the main characters, the character that we've most been scrambling around to try and figure out what he's about. There have been so many different theories about Bran is the Night King, or Bran is going to be the one who's going to bring about the end of the Long Night, or whatever. And there's so many of these big theories. The time-traveling Bran one, I'm a big fan of. But there's so many of these theories that are out there that is just basically people in the community trying to figure out what is it that he's there for. And I think that's because of what we were talking about earlier, as the fact that he was introduced as clearly a main character. And then we've had fewer and fewer chapters from him as we've been going on. And that means that we've had less and less information and fewer hints about what he might be about. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happened now is that, as with a lot of the main characters, not the lesser characters, it's been very clear that their fate is not necessarily the same. So don't expect Jorah Mormont or whatever to have exactly the same fate in the books as he did on the show.
Yeah.
But the main characters, their fate is going to be the same. The context for that may well and probably will be different. How they get there may well and probably will be different, but their end point, I think, will be the same. So I think what we're doing now is trying to pick out the path from where we're at in the books to this kind of endpoint where Bran is king. And that, I think, is the exciting bit that we still have to win. I think you've been doing a fantastic job working your way through the books, trying to pick out this foreshadowing to get us there.
If I didn't make it clear, that is the purpose of our reread. We're not going through rehashing the cat's paw dagger. Of course, it's not called that in the books, but you know what I mean. We're not trying to rehash all the reasoning behind the War of the Five Kings. We cover that stuff briefly, but it's all about looking for these things that we missed. That's the kind of thing we're really hunting for. Just to add on to what you said about the end state, it's an interesting debate because there's a lot of people who, well, what is the ending? When does the ending start? Like what last few chapters count as the ending? Or are we talking about ending for individual characters? So it's there's a lot of semantics that gets involved here. What does similar mean? Who's a main character? Like, yeah, Jon's a main character, Dany's a main character, Bran's a main character, Arya's a main character, Sansa, Jaime, Cersei, but is Euron a main character? Probably not to most people, but some to people he is. Varys, is he a main character? A lot of people would say yes. A lot of people would say no. Davos, that's a real tough one because he's so beloved, but he's not in the first book. I don't know, and those are the characters where there's a bit of a gray area. Like, does Davos have the same ending or a similar ending? I don't know about that. Jaime and Cersei are the one where I really think that's where there's a divergence. Because, yeah, I think they'll both end up dead. If you think that counts as similar, then okay, then dead is similar to dead. But I think their circumstances massively. I mean, there's no Valonqar, and Jaime didn't kill Cersei. She had rocks fall on her head, and so. But you could still call. I'm okay with someone calling that similar because they're both going to end up dead probably. But I think that's a good example of where someone could push back, and they'd be entitled to their opinion, and that would be fair. But it's also a matter. But it is a matter of opinion, I think.
Well, I mean, I think with Jaime and Cersei, I'll go as far as to say I think we know that they're going to die together.
Yeah, that I agree with. I think,
I think that is clearly foreshadowed in the books. Mm-hmm. We entered this world together. We will leave it together. It's said 2 or 3 times in the books. So I think that is there, but the context, as you say, the whole Valonqar thing, I think has to come through somehow. But that is a complete digression. We were talking about Bran. Let's end it up there. We got one final question that perhaps you can pick up on. Andrew K was saying, what do you think if we get King Bran similar to the show's version? What is the overarching, or what is George R.R. Martin's overarching message with that? So perhaps you could start with that and then end up with letting anyone who doesn't know where you exist on the internet, where you are.
Wait, what was the question again?
What message is there? Is there something that attached to Bran being king?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. That's a big open-ended question. I think maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's just that George wanted to write it this way. It's an interesting ending. It's an unexpected ending. He likes having a clever ending that people will talk about. But it could be that. I mean, he doesn't like monarchy. Not that monarchy is some sort of big problem in the Western world. We're not plagued, by literal kings and queens in that sense that they are in Westeros. But I do think that there's some statements on power, and that's something we talked about earlier. Like, will Bran get corrupted by his power? If he does get somewhat corrupted by his power, that's a statement. Like I said, it's a common enough statement. It's something we're all familiar with in varying degrees of the corruption that comes with power. So he could be making statements on that. That there is no way to do this right without magic. You can't have you can't have kings and queens without magic. It's not going to work. So I don't know about a message there. Maybe I just haven't heard a good theory there, or heard the right. Maybe someone will say something. Maybe you've got an idea that I'll go, oh yeah, that's a good one. But I haven't heard one that really strikes me as some philosophical point George is trying to get across by having Bran be king. Nothing has really stood out to me in that regard. But do you have one?
No, and I think you're right. I think that George R.R. Martin has been very clear. He's not giving us an overarching moral message. What he's wanting is for us to be drawing the messages from it that are applicable for ourselves, and that's something that he has been actually very similar to J.R.R. Tolkien, who was very clear that his stories were about applicability, not allegory. And I think that is where George R.R. Martin is at, is that this is his story, and I think that we are then supposed to draw from it our own judgments about whether or not this is a good thing. He is not going to spoon feed us a moral message out of this.
Yeah.
But you did digress away from the most important part of this stream, which is telling people where they can find you on the internet.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We are at History of Westeros on YouTube and any podcast feed that is out there, except Stitcher. I think we're not on Stitcher because I don't like Stitcher, but we're on Spotify and iTunes and all those places. That address or that name will also find us on Twitter, and we have a Facebook group as well that we host some nice discussions and talk about sort of stuff like this. We review the chapters that we're about to cover in the pod as well. And we have a Patreon, of course, and that's patreon.com History of Westeros. So I think that covers it. We have a website too, historyofwesteros.com, and that has kind of a repository of all the things I just said, as well as our recent episodes. So you can approach it a lot of different ways, depending on your favorite way to engage online.
Awesome. Well,
and thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Always an honor and a pleasure. So thank you so much for coming on. I will definitely have you back on again at some point as soon as possible. Guys, thank you so much for the chat. We've had some fantastic questions. I say it every time, but thank you to my patrons. I cannot do this without you. Your support is what allows me to be focusing my attention on doing this and giving it as much time as I do. So guys, thank you. I'll be back this time next week. I'll quickly take Aziz off screen for one moment to say that after this, if you're watching this not live, somewhere around here is going to be appearing a link to other live streams I've been doing with other people. Somewhere around here is going to be appearing a link to my Patreon page if you're at all interested in either supporting the channel or getting access to some exclusive stuff I do just for my patrons, like audio narrations from the pre-release chapters of The Winds of Winter. But thank you so much. Thank you to Aziz. Guys, I will see you same time next week. Take care.
Bye.